What if I told you the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima was the best-case scenario? Welcome to What If Horizons, where we explore the darkest roads not taken. Let's talk about August 1945 without the atomic finale. No flash of light brighter than the sun. No shadows burned into concrete. Just more war. More of everything awful. Picture this alternative timeline. Truman blinks. The bomb stays in the box. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, becomes reality. Instead of 2 nuclear strikes, we get 1,000,000 conventional ones. The beaches of Kyushu would have made D-Day look like a picnic. Japanese schoolchildren were being trained to fight with sharpened bamboo sticks. The US had so many Purple Heart medals manufactured for the expected casualties that we're still using that stockpile today. And here's the darkly funny part. The invasion plans included demonstration nukes, detonating atomic bombs offshore to scare Japan into surrender without civilian casualties. Because nothing says, "We come in peace," like a warning mushroom cloud. The Soviet factor gets even messier. Without the quick Japanese surrender, Stalin keeps his promise to join the Pacific War. Instead of just grabbing Manchuria, the Red Army might have rolled into Hokkaido. Imagine Cold War tensions with Soviet troops occupying northern Japan. Meanwhile, the firebombing campaign continues. Tokyo was already rubble. By August 1945, LeMay's bombers were running out of cities to burn. They'd started targeting smaller towns with populations under 30,000. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey calculated we'd have torched every square mile of urban Japan by New Year's 1946. The humanitarian math gets grim. The bombs killed 200,000. The invasion might have killed 10 million. But here's what nobody mentions. The bombs saved Japanese lives too. Their military was hoarding food for the decisive battle. Starvation deaths were already mounting when the emperor surrendered. And let's not forget the prisoners of war. Thousands of Allied captives were being worked to death in Japanese camps. Every extra month of war meant more skeletons in the mines of Manchuria. So was the atomic option really the merciful choice? Or just the least terrible option in a buffet of horrors? Stick around as we dive deeper into this radioactive thought experiment. Now let's talk about what happens after the invasion succeeds, because make no mistake, it would have succeeded eventually. The question isn't whether America wins, but what's left when the dust settles. Picture Tokyo in 1946. Not the bustling metropolis we know today, but a smoldering ruin patrolled by Marines with flamethrowers. The Emperor's Palace, probably a parking lot for Sherman tanks. And here's the kicker. Without those 2 dramatic atomic exclamation points ending the war, Japan's surrender looks very different. Instead of the relatively orderly occupation we got, imagine something closer to Germany's partition. The Soviets would almost certainly demand their piece of the pie. Maybe Hokkaido becomes the People's Democratic Republic of Japan, complete with statues of Lenin wearing a kimono. Tokyo could have been divided like Berlin, with American and Soviet troops staring each other down across the Imperial Palace moat. And speaking of the emperor, Hirohito might not have survived an invasion. The US planned to try him as a war criminal if they had to fight their way to Tokyo. No emperor means no symbolic figurehead to smooth the transition to democracy. Post-war Japan could have looked more like post-war Germany, complete denazification, or in this case, deshintoization. The cultural ripple effects are staggering. No, Godzilla, for starters, that whole franchise was born from nuclear anxiety. Japanese cinema would have processed their trauma through different metaphors. Maybe we'd have gotten gigantic fire-breathing B-29 instead. Meanwhile back in America, the victory parades would have been even more insane. Imagine Times Square packed with cheering crowds, and 500,000 grieving families. The psychological impact of those million casualties would have reshaped American society. We might have gotten universal healthcare by 1950, support our troops, takes on new meaning when half the country knows someone who came home in a box. And here's the real mind bender. Without the shock of atomic weapons, does the Cold War stay cold? The Soviet Union might have been more adventurous without that clear demonstration of American technological superiority. Stalin was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. Seeing what one bomb could do kept him cautious. Without that, well, let's just say the Berlin airlift might have involved more actual fighting. The nuclear arms race gets delayed, but when it comes, it's even scarier. Imagine both superpowers developing nukes in the 1950s without having seen what they could actually do to cities. The first test might have been over a battlefield. That's a recipe for accidental apocalypse if I ever heard one. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we get to the Cold War, we need to talk about what happens to all those scientists who didn't get to play with their new toys at Hiroshima. Let's talk about the scientists. The Manhattan Project wasn't just about ending the war, it was a bunch of geniuses playing with the universe's most dangerous toys. And if the bombs never drop, those restless minds don't just pack up and go home. First, Oppenheimer. Without Hiroshima, he doesn't become destroyer of worlds. Instead, he's just another physicist with government funding and a guilty conscience. Maybe he writes poetry full-time. Maybe he starts a cult. The man had range. But more importantly, without that first real-world test, does anyone truly grasp what these bombs can do? The nuclear program continues in the shadows. The US military still has these shiny new weapons, and they're itching to use them. Maybe they test one in the Pacific, just to scare Stalin. Maybe they accidentally vaporize an island. The point is, the genie's out of the bottle, but nobody's seen it in action. That's how you get complacency. Meanwhile, the Soviets are spying harder than ever. Without Hiroshima as a wake-up call, Stalin might not have pushed his own program so aggressively. But he's still getting blueprints from Klaus Fuchs and friends. The nuclear arms race still happens, just slower, messier, with more guesswork. Imagine both sides building doomsday devices based purely on theory. What could go wrong? And here's the darkly funny part. Without those two real-world demonstrations, the 1950s might have been full of tactical nukes. Generals back then thought atomic bombs were just bigger artillery. No fallout concerns, no long-term radiation, just a really big boom. We could have ended up with nuclear landmines, nuclear torpedoes, maybe even nuclear hand grenades for particularly motivated infantry. The civilian applications get weird too. No Hiroshima means no nuclear fear, which means no backlash against nuclear power. The 1950s could have been full of atomic cars, atomic planes, atomic toasters. Your kitchen might have had a mini reactor next to the coffee maker. Sure, everyone gets cancer by 40, but think of the convenience. But the biggest change, the space race. Without the V2 rocket scientists getting scooped up by both sides, rocketry stays primitive. No Sputnik, no moon landing, just a bunch of frustrated engineers trying to make bigger bombers. The 20th century's greatest achievements might have been delayed by decades, all because we didn't drop two bombs in 1945. And speaking of delays, let's talk about Japan's recovery. Now let's examine Japan's fate in this no-nukes timeline. Because without those two atomic exclamation points, Japan's surrender isn't sudden, it's slow, messy, and far more destructive. The firebombing continues. By August 1945, Curtis LeMay's B-29s had already burned 64 cities to the ground. Tokyo was a charcoal sketch of its former self. Without the shock of atomic weapons, this destruction would have continued city by city, block by block, until literally nothing remained to burn. The U.S. Strategic Air Command had plans to continue bombing through 1946. There were still 60 smaller cities untouched. The blockade tightens. No fishing boats leave harbor. No rice shipments reach cities. The starvation that was already killing thousands becomes catastrophic. Historians estimate Japan's food reserves would have run out by November 1945. We're not just talking rationing, we're talking mass famine on a medieval scale. The military government's response: more madness. The Kyuho incident, where fanatical officers tried to steal the emperor's surrender recording, might have succeeded in this timeline. The war cabinet could have fractured completely, with some generals surrendering while others fought on. Picture a divided Japan with American forces advancing from the south while holdout units wage guerrilla warfare from mountain bases. And here's the grim irony: more Japanese would have died under conventional warfare than from the atomic bombs. Radiation sickness is horrific, but it affected thousands. The invasion and continued bombing would have killed millions. The bombs were terrible, but the alternative was worse. The occupation becomes a nightmare. Instead of a relatively orderly transition under MacArthur, imagine years of insurgency. Kamikaze pilots become suicide bombers. Underground networks of imperial loyalists sabotage reconstruction. The Black Dragon Society might have morphed into Japan's version of the Viet Cong. Cultural consequences. No Japan Inc. Economic miracle. No Sony, no Toyota, no Godzilla movies. Just a broken nation that takes decades longer to recover. Their art would be darker. No cheerful anime, just brutal survivor stories. Their politics would be fractured. Imagine if the imperial fanatics never lost credibility. And here's the real kicker. Without that clean atomic ending, does Japan ever fully reconcile with its war crimes? The nuclear attacks let Japan position itself as a victim. Take that away, and the narrative shifts. More apologies, more denial. It's impossible to say, but certainly more bitterness on all sides. But let's zoom out, because Japan's fate is just one piece of this puzzle. What happens in Korea when the Soviets arrive without Japan's sudden surrender? What happens in China when Mao's communists don't get that brief post-war window of stability? The dominoes keep falling. Let's shift our focus to Korea, because without the atomic bomb, the Korean War might have started a lot sooner and ended a lot messier. When Japan surrendered in our timeline, Korea was split at the 38th parallel, Soviets in the north, Americans in the south. But without that sudden surrender, the Soviets would have had more time to push further south. Picture this. Stalin's tanks roll through Seoul, and suddenly the entire peninsula is a communist stronghold. No South Korea, no K-pop, no Parasite winning Oscars, just one big, unified dictatorship under Kim Il-sung, or worse, a Soviet puppet state. But let's not forget the Americans. They're not just going to let Korea go without a fight. Without the bomb, the US military is already in full invasion mode in Japan. It's not a stretch to imagine them diverting troops to Korea to stop the Soviets. So instead of the Korean War starting in 1950, it starts in 1946, with way less preparation and way more chaos. And here's the kicker. Without the bomb as a deterrent, the Soviets might have been more aggressive. They could have pushed into Japan, too. Picture a divided Japan, like Germany, with Soviet troops in the north and American troops in the south. Tokyo could have been the new Berlin, a city split in two, with checkpoints, spies, and the constant threat of war. The ripple effects don't stop there. Without South Korea as a US ally, the balance of power in Asia shifts dramatically. China, already in the middle of its civil war, might have leaned even harder into communism with a fully communist Korea next door. Mao's revolution could have been bloodier, faster, and more far-reaching. And let's not forget the cultural impact. No South Korea means no Samsung, no Hyundai, and no Gangnam-style asterisk. The global tech and entertainment landscape would look very different. Maybe North Korea becomes the cultural powerhouse instead, but let's be honest, it's more likely we'd all be listening to Soviet-approved propaganda songs. But here's the real mind-bender. Without the Korean War as we know it, the Cold War might have taken a different shape. The US and the Soviet Union might have clashed in other ways, or not at all. The domino theory, the arms race, the space race, all of it could have been delayed, altered, or avoided entirely. Next up, what happens to China in this timeline? Spoiler: it's not pretty. Now let's talk about China, because without the atomic bomb, the Chinese Civil War becomes a whole different beast. In our timeline, Japan's sudden surrender gave Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists a brief window to regroup. They reclaimed territory, rearmed, and prepared to fight Mao's communists. But without that surrender, the nationalists are stuck fighting both Japan and the communists at the same time. Spoiler: they lose. Badly. Picture this. Mao's forces, already battle-hardened from years of guerrilla warfare, sweep across China while the nationalists are distracted. The Soviets, emboldened by their gains in Korea and Japan, pour resources into supporting Mao. By 1946, the communists control most of China, and Chiang Kai-shek is exiled to Taiwan even earlier than in our timeline. But here's the twist. Without the bomb, the US might have been less willing to intervene. No Hiroshima means no clear demonstration of American power, and no Cold War mindset yet. The Truman Doctrine probably doesn't exist. The US might have just shrugged and let China go red without a fight. And that changes everything. A stronger, earlier communist China means a more aggressive Mao. The Great Leap Forward might have started sooner, and been even more disastrous. The Cultural Revolution could have been bloodier and longer. Millions more might have died in famines and purges, all because the bomb wasn't dropped. But let's not forget Taiwan. In this timeline, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists are even weaker. The US might have abandoned them entirely, leaving Taiwan to fall to the communists. No Taiwan means no tech giants like TSMC, no democratic counterweight to China, and no geopolitical headaches for Beijing. And here's the real kicker. Without the bomb, the US-China relationship might have been worse. No Hiroshima means no Japanese occupation of China to unite against. No Cold War means no Nixon opening up to China in the 1970s. The two powers might have stayed enemies for decades longer, or even gone to war. But the ripple effects don't stop there. A stronger, earlier communist China means a weaker Soviet Union. Mao and Stalin were already rivals in our timeline. In this one, Mao might have outright challenged Stalin for leadership of the communist world. The Sino-Soviet split could have happened sooner, and been even uglier. Next up, what happens to Europe in this timeline? Spoiler: it's a mess. Now let's turn our attention to Europe, because without the atomic bomb, the post-war landscape looks very different. In our timeline, the bomb's use in Japan sent a clear message to Stalin. The US had a weapon that could end wars and civilizations in an instant. That message kept Stalin cautious, at least for a while. But without Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that message never gets sent. Stalin might have been more aggressive, more willing to push his luck in Europe. Picture this: the Soviet Union, emboldened by its gains in Asia, decides to test the West's resolve. Maybe they push further into Germany, beyond the agreed-upon zones of occupation. Maybe they try to take all of Berlin. The US and its allies, already stretched thin by the war in the Pacific, might have struggled to respond. And here's the kicker: without the bomb, the US might have been less willing to stand up to Stalin. No Hiroshima means no clear demonstration of American power, and no Cold War mindset yet. The Marshall Plan probably doesn't happen. NATO maybe never gets formed. Europe could have been left to fend for itself, or fall entirely under Soviet influence. But let's not forget the human cost. In our timeline, the bomb's use in Japan brought a swift end to the war, saving millions of lives. Without that swift end, the war drags on, and so does the suffering. Millions more might have died in Europe, from starvation, disease, and continued fighting. And here's the real mind-bender: without the bomb, the Cold War might have stayed cold. The US and the Soviet Union might have clashed in other ways, or not at all. The arms race, the space race, the proxy wars, all of it could have been delayed, altered, or avoided entirely. But the ripple effects don't stop there. Without the bomb, the US might have been less involved in Europe's reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Western Europe and cement American influence, might have never happened. Europe could have been left to rebuild on its own, or fall entirely under Soviet control. Next up, what happens to the rest of the world in this timeline? Spoiler: it's complicated. Now let's look at the broader global picture, because without the atomic bomb, decolonization takes a very different path. In our timeline, the bomb's use signaled a shift in global power dynamics. The old empires were fading, and the US and Soviet Union were rising as superpowers. But without that clear demonstration of destructive capability, the European colonial powers might have clung to their empires longer. Picture this: Britain and France, not yet bankrupted by war, decide to hold on to their colonies by force. No swift independence for India in 1947. No gradual withdrawal from Africa. Instead, prolonged and bloody wars of independence across Asia and Africa, with the colonial powers using conventional weapons to suppress rebellions. And here's the twist: without the bomb, the Cold War rivalry doesn't immediately shape these conflicts. The US and Soviet Union aren't yet locked in their global chess match, so they don't rush to support opposing sides in every liberation movement. Local revolutions succeed or fail on their own terms, for better or worse. But let's not forget the Middle East. In our timeline, the bomb's existence helped freeze certain conflicts in place. Without it, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War might have escalated further. Israel, without the implicit protection of American nuclear might, could have faced even greater threats. The entire region's balance of power shifts unpredictably. And here's the real kicker: without the bomb, the concept of mutually assured destruction never emerges. Wars between nations remain thinkable. The 1950s and 1960s might have seen more conventional wars between major powers, perhaps even direct US-Soviet clashes. The delicate peace maintained by nuclear terror simply wouldn't exist. But the ripple effects continue. Without nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent, countries invest more in conventional armies. The military-industrial complex grows even larger. The world spends more on tanks and bombers than on rebuilding and development. The space race might never happen. Why explore space when you're busy preparing for the next land war? Next up, how does this alternate timeline affect science and technology? The answers might surprise you. Let's examine how science and technology develop in this no-nukes timeline, because without the atomic bomb, the trajectory of innovation takes some wild turns. First, consider nuclear physics itself. Without the Manhattan Project's success being demonstrated so spectacularly, government funding for big science projects dries up almost immediately. No more blank checks for particle accelerators or theoretical research. The golden age of physics might have ended before it really began. Einstein and Oppenheimer become footnotes rather than icons. Rocket technology suffers too. In our timeline, the captured German V2 scientists were put to work developing missiles to deliver nuclear warheads. Without that urgent need, rocketry remains primitive for decades longer. No Sputnik in 1957. No moon landing in 1969. The space age gets postponed indefinitely while everyone focuses on perfecting better bombers. Computers evolve differently too. The Manhattan Project drove early computer development to handle complex calculations. Without that push, digital computing might have remained a niche academic curiosity well into the 1960s. Your smartphone, probably still a science fiction fantasy in this alternate 2023. Medicine takes a hit as well. Radiation research led directly to breakthroughs in cancer treatment and medical imaging. No nuclear program means no MRI machines, no advanced chemotherapy. We'd still be diagnosing illnesses with guesswork and leeches. But here's the strangest twist. Without the existential threat of nuclear war, the environmental movement never gains traction. No Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring about pesticide fallout. No anti-nuclear activists morphing into climate change warriors. The planet might be even more polluted in this timeline, just from good old-fashioned coal and oil rather than radioactive fallout. The entertainment industry transforms completely. No Godzilla movies. No Drive, Strangelove. No Fallout video games. James Bond still exists, but his villains have to find non-nuclear ways to threaten the world. And perhaps most surprisingly, the internet might never emerge. ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, was developed to maintain communications after a nuclear attack. Without that doomsday scenario looming, we might still be communicating through paper memos and rotary phones. Next up, how does culture and society evolve without the atomic shadow hanging over everything? The differences are profound. Now, let's dive into how culture and society evolve without the atomic shadow hanging over everything. The differences are profound and far-reaching. Without the existential threat of nuclear annihilation, the collective psyche of humanity shifts dramatically. The Cold War paranoia that defined the 1950s and 1960s never takes root. No duck-and-cover drills in schools. No dystopian novels like 1984 or On the Beach. Art, literature, and music reflect a world less obsessed with doom and more focused on progress, or perhaps complacency. The counterculture movements of the 1960s might never have happened. Without the fear of nuclear war, there's no urgent push for peace, love, and rebellion. The Beatles might have stayed a cheerful boy band. Woodstock, just a field in upstate New York. Science fiction takes a completely different turn. No Star Trek exploring the final frontier as a metaphor for Cold War tensions. No Dr. Strangelove satirizing the madness of mutually assured destruction. Instead, we might have gotten more utopian visions of the future, or perhaps more mundane stories about everyday life. Even sports and entertainment change. The Olympics, often a proxy for Cold War rivalries, might have remained a purely athletic competition. The space race, which captured the world's imagination, never happens, so no moon landing to unite humanity, even briefly, in awe. But here's the real kicker. Without the atomic shadow, humanity might have become complacent. The bomb forced us to confront our own fragility and the consequences of our actions. Without that wake-up call, would we have taken environmental issues seriously? Would we have worked as hard to prevent global conflicts? What do you think about this alternate cultural landscape? Would the world have been better or worse without the atomic shadow? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration, please hit the like button and subscribe for more fascinating what-if stories. Your support helps us continue creating content like this. Thank you for joining us on this journey through alternate history. We look forward to seeing you in the next installment of this special series.